When my grandmother passed away last spring, she left me her beautiful Victorian house in Maple Ridge Estates. I thought it would be a peaceful place to start fresh after my divorce, but I had no idea I was about to meet Karen Whitmore, the most power-hungry HOA president in the history of suburban America. What started as petty complaints about my garden gnomes would escalate into an all-out war that would cost Karen everything she held dear. The house had been in our family for 60 years, long before the neighborhood association even existed. Grandma Rose had watched the subdivision grow around her property, and she always told me stories about how she had to fight to keep her Victorian charm when everyone else was building cookie-cutter colonials. The house sat on a corner lot with mature oak trees and a wraparound porch that looked like something from a fairy tale. More importantly, it was completely paid off and worth about $800,000 in today's market. I moved in on a Tuesday morning in May, and Karen showed up at my door before I had even finished unloading the moving truck. She was exactly what you would picture when someone says HOA president. Perfectly styled blonde hair, pearl earrings, and a clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield. Her smile was so fake it could have been purchased on Amazon with next-day delivery. Hello there. I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I wanted to personally welcome you to our community and make sure you understand our guidelines for maintaining property values. I invited her in for coffee, thinking this was just a friendly neighbor visit. How wrong I was. Karen spent the next hour lecturing me about lawn maintenance schedules, approved paint colors, and the 17 different permits I would need for various home improvements. She handed me a binder that was thicker than most college textbooks, filled with rules about everything from mailbox heights to the acceptable types of door knockers. The woman had actually laminated a chart showing approved seasonal decorations with specific date ranges for when they could be displayed. The first red flag should have been when she mentioned that several longtime residents had recently sold their homes to the HOA for quote-unquote fair market assessments. We find it much easier to maintain community standards when we have more direct control over property management. Your grandmother was quite stubborn about some of our newer initiatives, but I'm sure you'll be more reasonable. The way she said reasonable made my skin crawl, but I smiled and nodded, planning to just keep my head down and avoid any drama. That plan lasted exactly 5 days. On Sunday morning, I woke up to find a bright yellow violation notice taped to my front door. Apparently, my garden gnomes were in violation of Section 12-A of the Community Standards, which prohibited lawn ornaments that could be considered whimsical or childish in nature. I had 3 business days to remove them or face daily fines of $50. I could not believe someone had actually written down a rule against being whimsical in your own yard. I removed the gnomes and stored them in my garage, figuring it wasn't worth fighting over something so silly. But Karen was just getting started. The next week brought a violation for my mailbox being 2 inches too tall, according to their measuring standards. The week after that, she cited me for having too many different types of flowers in my front garden, claiming it created visual chaos that negatively impacted neighborhood aesthetics. Each violation came with increasingly aggressive language about maintaining property values and community standards. By the end of June, I realized Karen was systematically targeting my property. She would drive by at different times of day, taking photos with a professional-looking camera and making notes on her clipboard. I watched from my kitchen window as she measured the height of my fence with a tape measure, looking absolutely delighted when she discovered it was 1/4 inch taller than the maximum allowed height. The woman was treating HOA enforcement like it was her full-time job and her personal mission to make my life miserable. The harassment escalated when I decided to plant a vegetable garden in my backyard. I had checked the rules carefully, and vegetable gardens were explicitly allowed in rear yards as long as they were properly maintained and not visible from the street. I spent a weekend building raised beds and planting tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. The garden was beautiful and completely hidden behind my house. But somehow Karen found out about it within 24 hours. She showed up on Monday morning with 2 other HOA board members, demanding access to my backyard for an inspection. We have received reports of unpermitted structures and potential violations of our landscaping standards. As board members, we have the right to inspect any property for compliance issues. I refused to let them onto my private property without proper notice, which only made Karen more aggressive. She informed me that my lack of cooperation would be noted in their official records and could impact future enforcement actions. The next violation notice claimed my vegetable garden constituted a commercial farming operation because I had more than 12 individual plants. According to some obscure subsection I had missed, any garden with more than 12 plants required special approval and annual permits. The fine was $200 per day until I either removed the excess plants or obtained proper permits. When I went to the HOA office to apply for the permits, Karen informed me they were not currently accepting applications for agricultural permits due to a backlog of other requests. I consulted with a lawyer at this point, and he confirmed what I suspected. Karen was selectively enforcing rules and creating bureaucratic obstacles specifically to target my property. However, fighting each individual violation would cost more in legal fees than just paying the fines. The lawyer warned me that some HOA boards had been known to use accumulated fines and violations as justification for forced sales, but he assured me that would never hold up in court given my property's clear title and long family history. That summer turned into a nightmare of constant harassment. Karen found violations everywhere. My porch light was the wrong color temperature, my doormat had fringes that violated the no loose decorative elements rule, and my bird feeder was apparently creating a public nuisance by attracting wildlife. She started scheduling board meetings specifically to discuss my property, sending me certified letters about hearings where they would vote on my various violations. The woman was spending more time documenting my supposed infractions than most people spend at their actual jobs. The breaking point came in August when I received a certified letter informing me that my accumulated violations had reached a level requiring intervention by the HOA legal committee. According to their calculations, I owed over $15,000 in fines for various infractions dating back to my first week in the neighborhood. The letter stated that if the fines were not paid within 30 days, the HOA would begin proceedings to place a lien on my property and potentially force a sale to recover their costs. I immediately called my lawyer, who was outraged by what he called a clear case of targeted harassment and potential fraud. However, he also warned me that some courts had upheld HOA liens in cases where homeowners had genuinely violated community standards. The fact that Karen had been so meticulous about documenting everything and following their internal procedures, even if those procedures were unreasonable, might give her case some legal standing. He recommended I start gathering evidence of selective enforcement and document any instances where other homeowners were not being held to the same standards. That's when I started my own investigation into Karen's activities. I spent weekends driving through the neighborhood with my camera, documenting dozens of violations that were being ignored on other properties. Mailboxes that were clearly the wrong height, gardens with far more than 12 plants, and lawn ornaments that were significantly more whimsical than my modest garden gnomes. I also discovered that 3 other longtime residents had recently sold their properties to the HOA for well below market value after being hit with similar violation campaigns. The pattern was clear. Karen was using selective enforcement to drive out homeowners she didn't like or who owned particularly valuable properties. The HOA would then purchase these homes at discount prices and either rent them out or flip them for significant profits. My grandmother's Victorian house, sitting on a premium corner lot, would be worth a fortune to someone who could buy it for the cost of outstanding fines and liens. I was documenting violations on Elm Street when I met Mrs. Chun, an elderly woman who was tending to her beautiful rose garden. She noticed me taking photos and asked if I was working for the HOA. When I explained my situation, her expression changed completely. "Oh, honey, you're fighting Karen Whitmore? That woman destroyed my friend Margaret's life last year. Forced her to sell her house for practically nothing using the same tricks she's pulling on you." Mrs. Chun invited me in for tea and told me the whole story. Margaret had lived in Maple Ridge Estates for 20 years before Karen became HOA president. Within 6 months of Karen taking office, Margaret started receiving violation notices for infractions that had never been issues before. Karen claimed Margaret's fence was an unauthorized structure, her flower boxes were fire hazards, and her decorative shutters violated the architectural standards. The harassment continued for months until Margaret, who was on a fixed income, couldn't afford to fight anymore and sold her house to the HOA for $60,000 less than its appraised value. But Mrs. Chun had a secret that would change everything. "I've been keeping detailed records of Karen's activities because I knew someone like you would eventually need them. I've lived here for 30 years, and I've seen what she's been doing to people. I have photos, dates, documents, everything. She disappeared into her spare bedroom and returned with 3 large photo albums filled with evidence of selective enforcement, discriminatory practices, and what appeared to be a systematic scheme to acquire valuable properties through manufactured violations. Mrs. Chun had been photographing violations throughout the neighborhood for over 2 years, documenting how Karen ignored identical issues on properties owned by her friends while aggressively pursuing violations on properties she wanted to acquire. She had pictures of board members' homes with violations that were identical to ones that had resulted in massive fines for other homeowners. She even had audio recordings from HOA meetings where Karen discussed targeting specific properties for enforcement actions. This was the evidence I needed, but Mrs. Chin warned me that simply exposing Karen's hypocrisy might not be enough to stop her. She has 3 lawyers on retainer and enough money to fight legal challenges for years. You need to beat her at her own game, using her own rules against her. Mrs. Chun was right, and as I studied all her documentation, a plan began to form in my mind. Karen had made one crucial mistake in her harassment campaign. She had created such detailed documentation of her own selective enforcement that it would be impossible for her to deny the pattern once it was exposed in the right forum. I spent the next 2 weeks researching HOA law and property regulations, looking for any leverage I could use against Karen's scheme. That's when I discovered something interesting about the Maple Ridge Estates HOA structure. According to their original charter, any homeowner could call for a special election to replace board members if they could demonstrate gross misconduct or violations of their fiduciary duties. The process required a petition signed by 25% of homeowners and evidence presented at a special hearing. But I had something even better in mind. During my research, I had learned about my grandmother's history with the neighborhood association. It turned out that Grandma Rose had been one of the original property owners who had fought against the HOA's formation in the first place. When the HOA was eventually established, she had negotiated special provisions that were grandfathered into the community charter. My property had certain exemptions and protections that Karen apparently didn't know about. The most important protection was something called a heritage property designation, which my grandmother had insisted on when the HOA was formed. This designation protected the property's historical character and limited the association's authority to enforce certain types of violations. Any attempt to force the sale of a heritage property required unanimous approval from the board plus approval from the county historical preservation committee. Karen could rack up all the fines she wanted, but she couldn't actually force a sale of my property without jumping through hoops she probably didn't even know existed. Armed with this knowledge and Mrs. Chin's evidence, I scheduled a meeting with Karen to discuss the outstanding fines on my property. I wanted to give her one last chance to back down before I implemented my real plan. Karen agreed to meet at the HOA office on a Thursday afternoon, and she brought 2 other board members as witnesses to what she clearly expected would be my surrender. Karen's office was exactly what you would expect from someone drunk on petty power. Certificates and awards covering every wall, a desk positioned to loom over visitors, and filing cabinets full of violation notices organized by street address. She had prepared a folder with photos of all my supposed violations, along with a payment plan for the accumulated fines. I'm glad you've finally come to your senses about cooperating with community standards. We can work out a reasonable payment schedule, or if you prefer, the HOA is prepared to make you a fair offer for your property. Her offer was insulting. She wanted to buy my $800,000 property for $150,000, claiming that was generous considering the outstanding fines and liens. When I laughed at the ridiculous offer, Karen's mask of fake politeness finally slipped completely. You don't seem to understand your situation here. You owe this community over $15,000 in fines, and that number grows every day. We have photographic evidence of dozens of violations, and our legal team is prepared to pursue this matter aggressively. You can either work with us now or face foreclosure proceedings. That's when I pulled out Mrs. Chin's photo albums and placed them on Karen's desk. Her expression changed as she realized what she was looking at: clear evidence of identical violations on other properties that had never been cited, documented proof of selective enforcement, and photos of board members' homes with violations far worse than anything on my property. This is very interesting documentation. I wonder what the state attorney general's office would think about a systematic scheme to use selective HOA enforcement to acquire valuable properties at below market prices. Karen tried to maintain her composure, but I could see the panic in her eyes as she flipped through page after page of evidence. She started making excuses about different standards for different types of properties and claimed that her enforcement was based on complaint patterns rather than systematic targeting. But the evidence was overwhelming, and we both knew it. Every photo was dated and documented, creating an undeniable pattern of discriminatory enforcement. But I wasn't done yet. I pulled out a folder with copies of the original HOA charter and the heritage property designation for my grandmother's house. Karen's face went white as she read through the provisions that had protected my property for decades. It seems like you didn't do your homework before starting this harassment campaign. My property has special protections that your predecessors agreed to when this HOA was formed. You can't force a sale of a heritage property without unanimous board approval and County Historical Preservation Committee approval. The room was completely silent as Karen realized that her entire scheme had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of her own authority. She couldn't force the sale of my property even if every single violation was legitimate, which they clearly weren't based on the evidence of selective enforcement. But I had saved the best part for last. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out one final document, a complaint I had filed with the State Attorney General's office regarding fraudulent HOA practices and potential conspiracy to commit property fraud. The complaint included all of Mrs. Chen's evidence, documentation of the pattern of forced sales at below market prices, and a request for a full investigation into Karen's activities as HOA president. I submitted this complaint yesterday morning. I thought you should know that your harassment campaign is now a matter of public record and under official investigation. Karen's hands were shaking as she read through the complaint. She realized that I had not only blocked her scheme to steal my property, but I had also exposed her entire operation in a way that could result in criminal charges. The complaint documented everything: the selective enforcement, the manufactured violations, the below-market property acquisitions, and what appeared to be a systematic fraud scheme targeting vulnerable homeowners. But the real shock came when I revealed my final card. Oh, and Karen, you should know that Mrs. Chun has been recording HOA meetings for the past 2 years, including the ones where you discussed targeting my property specifically for acquisition. Those recordings are now part of the Attorney General's investigation, along with recordings of you discussing similar strategies for other properties you wanted to acquire. The color drained completely from Karen's face as she realized that her own words, recorded at official HOA meetings, provided evidence of intent to commit fraud. She had been so confident in her power and so careless with her language that she had essentially confessed to her crimes while conducting official HOA business. The recordings would prove that her violation campaigns were not about community standards at all, but about acquiring valuable properties through manufactured legal pressure. Karen looked at the evidence spread across her desk, then at the complaint that would destroy her reputation and potentially send her to prison, and finally at me with the dawning realization that she had been completely and utterly outmaneuvered by someone she had dismissed as just another victim of her petty power games. For the first time since I had met her, Karen Whitmore was completely speechless. Her carefully constructed facade of authority crumbled as she understood that every violation notice, every fine, every threatening letter had been part of building the case against her. She had been so focused on harassing me into submission that she had never considered I might be documenting her crimes just as meticulously as she had been manufacturing my violations. "You played me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This whole time, you were building a case against me." The realization hit her that while she thought she was the predator systematically hunting vulnerable homeowners, she had actually become the prey in a much larger game. Her own obsessive documentation, her recorded confessions, and her pattern of selective enforcement had created an airtight criminal case that would end her reign of terror forever. Karen Whitmore, the woman who had terrorized an entire neighborhood with petty power and fraudulent schemes, finally understood that she had been completely and permanently defeated by her own greed and arrogance.